The ground shook before the sound reached me. I felt it in my boots first, a deep tremor that meant something big had just died close by. Smoke rolled across the ridge in thick gray waves, and through it I could see Veltha, standing exposed on open ground, her escort scattered, her eyes locked on a shape rising out of the dust behind her. I did not think. I moved. The strike that would have ended her life instead caught my shoulder plate, and the force of it threw me sideways into the dirt. Pain exploded through my arm, sharp and hot, but the armor held. It always held. That was the whole point of it. I rolled once, came up on one knee, and pointed my weapon at the smoke until the threat passed. Silence settled over the ridge. My squad ran toward me, shouting words I could not fully hear yet through the ringing in my ears. Veltha stood a few feet away, untouched, her robes barely disturbed by the chaos that had almost taken her life. I expected many things in that moment. Relief, a word of thanks. Even nothing at all would have been fine. What I did not expect was the look she gave me, the way her eyes moved over my scorched armor, like she was inspecting damaged equipment, rather than looking at the man who had just taken a blow meant for her. "You threw yourself in front of that strike without command," she said. Her voice was calm, almost bored, as if she were commenting on the weather. "Reckless, predictable. This is what your kind does. You break yourselves apart for no reason, and you call it honor." My squad went quiet. Even the wind seemed to pause. "With respect," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "that reckless move just saved your life." She tilted her head, studying me the way someone studies an insect that has wandered somewhere it does not belong. "Do you think I asked for that? Do you think I need a human throwing his body around like a shield? You are not soldiers to us. You are tools. Useful tools, perhaps, because you do not value your own lives the way real people do. But do not mistake usefulness for worth." The words landed harder than the strike had. I heard someone behind me suck in a breath. My hands, still trembling from the impact, went still. "You are all the same," she continued, and now there was something almost pleased in her tone, as if she had been waiting a long time to say this out loud. "Crude. Simple. Built for one purpose only, to stand in front of danger so that beings who actually matter do not have to. You do not think, you do not plan, you only break, and you die, and somehow you call that a virtue. It is pathetic." I looked at her for a long moment. Behind me, I could hear Ethan shifting his weight, ready to speak up, ready to defend me the way soldiers do for each other. I raised a hand slightly, just enough to stop him. Something inside me had gone very quiet. Not angry, not exactly, quieter than anger. It felt like a door closing somewhere deep in my chest, one that had been left open for years, propped by hope that eventually the people we fought beside would see us as more than expendable. I reached up and unclasped the shoulder guard that had just saved my life. The metal was still warm from the strike. I let it fall to the ground between us. Veltha's eyes narrowed slightly, but she said nothing. Maybe she thought I was simply checking for damage. She had no idea what was actually happening. I unhooked the chest plate next, the one stamped with the Alliance crest, the one every human soldier wore as proof that we belonged here, that we had earned our place among the stars, fighting alongside people who were supposed to be our allies. I set it down carefully, almost gently, as if it deserved better treatment than the woman standing in front of me had given the man wearing it. "What are you doing?" Veltha asked, and for the first time there was a flicker of something other than contempt in her voice. Confusion, maybe. Uncertainty. I did not answer her. I unbuckled the leg guards, then the arm plating, piece by piece, laying each part down in a neat line at her feet like an offering, or maybe like evidence. My squad watched in stunned silence. Nobody moved to stop me. Nobody knew what to say. When the last piece came off, I stood there in the thin protective layer beneath, nothing left between me and the battlefield except the clothes on my back and whatever was left of my pride. The wind was cold against my skin, where the armor had been. "You said we are tools," I said quietly. Tools do not choose, so I am choosing not to be one anymore. Not for you. Veltha opened her mouth, but no words came out. For the first time since I had met her, she looked uncertain, almost small. I turned away from her and started walking, out past the ridge, out toward the open ground where the smoke still hung heavy and nothing was guaranteed except danger. Nobody called after me right away. I think everyone was too shocked to speak, including me. Ethan was the first to find his voice. Daniel, he called, and I heard the fear in it, the disbelief. Daniel, stop, what are you doing? I did not stop. I did not look back. Every step forward felt like shedding another layer of something I had carried for a long time without realizing how heavy it had become. The armor had protected my body. It had never protected the part of me that kept hoping to be seen as an equal. Behind me, I heard Veltha's voice, sharp now, commanding, ordering someone to stop me, to bring me back. Nobody moved fast enough. Or maybe nobody wanted to. The battlefield stretched out ahead, quiet and dangerous, smoke curling like fingers reaching toward the gray sky. I walked into it without armor, without a weapon raised, without a single promise that I would come out the other side. For the first time in years, I felt completely free. Word of what had happened spread through the camp faster than any official report could travel. By the time the sun began to dip behind the ridge, every soldier on that field, human and alien alike, had heard some version of the story. A human had removed his armor, after Veltha's words, and walked out unprotected into open territory. Some thought it was madness. Others thought it was the bravest thing they had ever seen. Nobody knew for certain what it meant, only that something had shifted, quietly and permanently. I kept walking. The ground beneath my boots was uneven, scorched in places from earlier fighting, littered with debris that told stories of battles fought long before I arrived. Every sound seemed louder without my armor. The wind against my skin, my own breathing, the distant crack of something collapsing far off in the smoke. I had spent years wrapped in layers of protective plating, and now, without it, the world felt sharper, more real, more dangerous in a way that almost felt honest. Behind me, back at the ridge, Ethan stood frozen for only a moment before turning to Laura, who had just arrived with the second squad. Her eyes went wide when she saw the empty space where my armor should have been, laid out neatly on the ground like a discarded uniform. What happened? She asked, though the pieces on the ground told most of the story already. Ethan explained quickly, his voice tight with disbelief. Laura listened, her jaw tightening with every word. When he finished, she looked out toward the smoke where I had disappeared, and something in her expression changed. It was not fear exactly, though there was plenty of that. It was recognition. She understood exactly why I had done it, even if she wished I had chosen a safer way to make the point. "We cannot just let him walk out there alone," Ethan said. "No," Laura agreed, "but we also cannot force him back, not after what she said to him." Veltha stood a short distance away, still staring at the pile of armor, as if it might rearrange itself and explain what had just occurred. Her escort waited nearby, unsure whether to speak or remain silent. She finally turned to one of her officers, a younger alien named Doran, and gave a sharp order to send a retrieval team after me. "With respect, Commander," Doran said carefully, "our forces are already stretched thin holding this position. If we pull soldiers to chase down one human who walked away on his own choice, we risk weakening the line." Veltha's eyes flashed with something close to anger, though I would learn later that some of that anger was aimed at herself, even if she was not ready to admit it yet. "Then send the humans," she said. "They understand him better than we do." Ethan did not wait for the order to be repeated. He and Laura moved out immediately, gathering a small group of volunteers, all of them human, all of them soldiers who had heard enough stories over the years to understand exactly what I was feeling in that moment. They did not follow to drag me back by force. They followed because that is what soldiers do when one of their own walks into danger, whether he asked for company or not. Meanwhile, out in the smoke, I had no idea any of this was happening. My focus had narrowed down to simple things. Where to place my next step, how to stay low when the ground dipped into a shallow trench, how to listen for the specific sound of danger approaching versus the ordinary noise of a battlefield settling after a fight. Without armor, every decision carried more weight. There was no plating to absorb a mistake. There was only me, and whatever instincts years of training had carved into my bones. A shape moved in the smoke ahead, low and quick. I froze, my body tensing before my mind fully processed what I had seen. It could have been another soldier, alien or human. It could have been something worse, a remnant of the enemy force that had struck earlier, still lingering in the wreckage looking for stragglers. I had no weapon raised, nothing but my hands and my wits, and for the first time since I started walking, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that perhaps this had not been the wisest decision. I pushed the thought aside. Whatever came next, I would face it standing on my own terms, not wrapped in equipment given by people who thought so little of the person wearing it. The shape resolved into a wounded alien soldier, not an enemy, but one of Veltha's own troops, separated from his unit during the earlier strike. He was pinned beneath a piece of fallen debris, unable to move, blood darkening the ground around him. His eyes went wide with surprise when he saw me approaching without armor, without a weapon, seemingly unprotected and yet completely calm. I did not hesitate. I moved to the debris and began working to shift it, using every bit of strength I had left after the earlier impact to my shoulder. He watched me, with an expression I recognized instantly, the same disbelief Veltha had shown, the same assumption that a human without armor and without orders would simply walk past him or leave him to whatever fate awaited. "Why?" he finally managed to ask, his voice strained with pain. "Why would you help me? Your own commander was insulted by mine. I heard what she said to you." I did not answer right away. I focused on shifting the debris another few inches, enough for him to pull his leg free. When it finally gave way, he gasped, relief and pain mixing together across his face. "Because you are not her," I said simply, "and I am not the thing she said I am." He stared at me for a long moment, then reached up and gripped my arm, not in gratitude exactly, but in something closer to recognition, one soldier acknowledging another, regardless of species or rank or the words spoken hours earlier by someone who had never bothered to learn either of our names. Ethan and Laura found us not long after, following the sound of voices through the drifting smoke. They stopped short when they saw me kneeling beside the wounded alien, helping him stand, steadying him despite my own exhaustion. Neither of them said a word about the armor lying back at the ridge. They simply moved to help carry the wounded soldier between us, and together we made our way toward the nearest medical position. Word of this small act spread just as quickly as word of my earlier decision had. A human without armor, without orders, without any reason to expect gratitude, had stopped to save the life of an alien soldier from Veltha's own command. It did not erase what had been said earlier. It did not undo the sting of her words. But it planted a seed of doubt among those who had heard her speak, a quiet question that began working its way through the ranks. If humans were truly nothing more than tools, why did they keep choosing, again and again, to act with more honor than the very people who dismissed them? By the time we reached the medical position, more soldiers had gathered, drawn by the growing rumor of what had happened out in the smoke. Some were human, watching me with a mixture of pride and worry. Others were alien, studying me with expressions I could not quite read, somewhere between curiosity and reluctant respect. Veltha arrived not long after, drawn by reports that her wounded soldier had been found and carried to safety by the very human she had humiliated only hours earlier. She stood at the edge of the gathered crowd, watching as the medical team worked, watching as I stood quietly to the side, saying nothing, asking for nothing. Her eyes met mine across the distance. For a long moment, Neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to say that words could fix. Not yet. But something had shifted in the air between us, subtle and undeniable. The first crack in a wall that had taken years to build and would take far longer to fully break down. I turned and walked away again, this time back toward my squad, back toward whatever came next. Behind me, I could feel her watching, and for the first time since she had spoken those cruel words, I sensed that she was beginning to understand exactly how wrong she had been. The battlefield around us had grown quieter as evening settled in, but I knew, deep down, that the real conflict had only just begun. Not the kind fought with weapons and armor, but the kind fought in silence, in choices, in the slow and difficult work of earning respect that should never have needed to be earned in the first place. 3 days passed before the true cost of what had happened became impossible to ignore. The front line, once held firm by a careful balance of human and alien forces working together, began to crack under pressure it had never faced before. Without the humans stepping forward the way they always had, absorbing the first waves of every assault, taking positions nobody else wanted to take, the Alliance forces found themselves exposed in ways they had never fully understood until it was almost too late. I had returned to my squad that first night. Not because Veltha had ordered it, but because Ethan and Laura had asked me to, and because leaving my fellow soldiers short-handed felt like a betrayal of a different kind, one I was not willing to commit. I did not put my armor back on. It remained where I had left it, still resting near the ridge where Veltha's forces had set up their forward command post, untouched, a quiet reminder that sat in plain view of everyone who passed. On the second day, a new assault came from the eastern flank, faster and heavier than anything the Alliance had anticipated. Without the usual human positioning at the front, absorbing impact and buying time for coordinated response, the alien lines buckled almost immediately. I watched from a distance as soldiers who had once looked at humans with quiet disdain scrambled to hold ground that would have been secure only days earlier. Doran, the young officer who had questioned Veltha's order to chase after me, found himself commanding the response to that eastern assault. He had studied human tactics for years, more out of professional curiosity than respect, and he understood better than most exactly what had been lost when soldiers like me stopped stepping forward without hesitation. He watched 2 of his own units nearly overrun before a scattered group of remaining human volunteers, working without clear orders, without coordination, managed to hold the line through sheer determination and the kind of instinctive teamwork that came from years of trusting each other completely. When the assault finally ended, the casualty reports came in heavier than anyone wanted to admit. Doran stood over the numbers for a long time before bringing them personally to Veltha's command tent. "This is what happens," he said quietly, "when the ones who always absorbed the worst of every fight decide they no longer wish to volunteer for that role." Veltha stared at the reports without speaking. Her hands, usually so composed, trembled slightly as she set the papers down. "They are still fighting," she said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. "They have not abandoned their posts." "No," Doran agreed. "But they are fighting as equals now, choosing their positions, choosing their risks. They are no longer throwing themselves in front of every strike without thought for their own survival. And Commander, forgive me for saying this plainly, but we relied on that far more than any of us wished to admit." Veltha said nothing for a long moment. Outside her tent, she could hear the sounds of the camp settling after another difficult day, voices calling out coordinates, medical teams moving between wounded soldiers, the low hum of equipment being repaired for whatever came next. Somewhere out there, my armor still sat where I had left it, a quiet symbol that had grown louder with every passing hour. Meanwhile, out on the eastern flank, I found myself in the middle of the very fighting that had just cost the Alliance so heavily. Without my armor, every moment carried a different kind of weight. I had learned to move differently, to think differently, relying on speed and awareness rather than the confidence that heavy plating had once given me. It was harder, it was more dangerous. But it also felt more honest, as if I were finally fighting as myself rather than as a shield for people who did not value the person standing behind it. A group of enemy scouts pushed through a gap in the line, moving fast toward a cluster of wounded soldiers who had not yet been evacuated. Ethan spotted them first and called out a warning, but the distance was too great for most of the squad to respond in time. I was closest, and without a second thought, I moved to intercept, using the terrain itself as cover since I no longer had armor to rely on. It was the hardest fight I had faced in years. Every instinct screamed that I was exposed, vulnerable, one mistake away from serious harm. But something else drove me forward, a clarity that had been missing before, a sense that I was fighting because I chose to, not because armor and orders made the choice feel automatic. I used the wreckage around me, the shifting smoke, every scrap of knowledge I had gathered over years of service, moving in ways that felt almost instinctive despite the danger. By the time the scouts were driven back, I was exhausted, bruised, and breathing hard, but the wounded soldiers behind me remained safe. Laura reached me first, gripping my shoulder, checking for injuries with the kind of urgency that comes from genuine worry rather than obligation. "You could have died out there," she said, her voice sharp with a mixture of relief and frustration. "I know," I said simply, "but I chose to be there. That matters more than you might think." She studied me for a long moment before nodding slowly, understanding, settling into her expression, even if she did not fully agree with the risk I had taken. Word of that skirmish reached Veltha's command tent within the hour, carried by soldiers who had witnessed it firsthand and could not stop talking about what they had seen. A human, without armor, without orders, had moved faster and more decisively than any of the alien scouts stationed nearby, saving lives that would have almost certainly been lost otherwise. Veltha listened to the report in silence, her expression unreadable. When the soldier delivering the news finished speaking, she asked only one question: "Is he still alive?" "Yes, Commander. Exhausted, but alive." She nodded once and dismissed the soldier, then sat alone in her tent for a long while, staring at nothing in particular. The events of the past 3 days had chipped away at something she had believed for her entire career, something she had never thought to question because it had simply always felt true. Humans were tools, useful, perhaps even remarkable in their willingness to sacrifice themselves, but tools nonetheless, built for a single purpose and easily replaced when that purpose was fulfilled. Except, I had not acted like a tool. I had acted like someone with a choice, someone who understood the risk and accepted it anyway, not because I was told to, but because I decided the people around me were worth protecting even after being told I was worthless. That contradiction sat heavily in her mind as the camp settled into another uneasy night. Reports continued to filter in from across the front, each one telling a similar story. Wherever humans had chosen to step forward, whether in small acts or larger ones, the line held. Wherever they had not, or where alien forces had tried to compensate without understanding the instinctive coordination that years of partnership had built, losses mounted quickly. By the 4th day, Alliance High Command began asking difficult questions of their own, questions that reached far beyond this single front and touched on years of policy regarding how human soldiers were treated, positioned, and valued within the broader Alliance structure. Officers who had never given the matter much thought suddenly found themselves reviewing casualty statistics stretching back years, statistics that painted an uncomfortable picture once properly examined. I knew nothing of these larger conversations happening far above my position on the front line. My world remained focused on smaller things, the next patrol, the next decision about where to stand and how to fight without the protection I had relied on for so long. My body ached constantly now, bruises layered over bruises, small cuts that would have never happened with armor, now slowing me down in ways I had to work harder to overcome. But something had changed in how my fellow soldiers looked at me. Human and alien alike had begun to watch me differently, not with pity or confusion, but with a kind of quiet respect that had been entirely absent before. Doran approached me directly on the evening of the fourth day, finding me alone near the edge of camp as I checked improvised bandages wrapped around a cut on my forearm. "May I speak with you?" he asked, his tone carrying none of the superiority I had grown used to hearing from Alliance officers. I nodded, curious despite my exhaustion. "I have studied human tactics for years," he said. "I always believed I understood your people. I was wrong. I did not understand the difference between duty and choice. I do now." I looked at him for a long moment, unsure how to respond to something so unexpected. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because someone should," he said simply, "and because I do not believe Veltha will find the words easily, even though I think she wishes to. Pride is a difficult thing to set aside, even when it is clearly deserved." I said nothing, but I felt something shift inside me, a small crack of warmth breaking through the cold resolve that had carried me through the past 4 days. It was not forgiveness, not yet, and certainly not for Veltha. But it was something, a sign that perhaps the walk I had taken away from that ridge had not been in vain after all. Later that night, alone under a sky filled with unfamiliar stars, I thought about everything that had happened since I removed my armor and walked away. I thought about the wounded soldier I had saved, about the scouts I had driven back, about the exhaustion in my bones and the strange clarity that had come with facing danger on my own terms rather than hiding behind equipment given grudgingly by people who saw me as disposable. I did not know yet how this would end. I did not know if Veltha would ever truly understand what her words had cost, not just to me, but to the fragile trust that held the entire alliance together. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty, as I finally allowed myself to rest that night, exhausted but unbroken. I had chosen to stand exposed rather than remain protected while being treated as less than human. And whatever came next, that choice was mine, made freely, and nobody could ever take that away from me again. The rescue call came in just after dawn on the 5th day, though I would not learn until later that it had truly been Veltha who insisted on joining the team sent to find me. I had pushed too far the night before, chasing down a small group of enemy soldiers who had broken through a weak point near the northern ridge, and in the process I had taken a fall down a steep embankment that left me unable to walk on my own. I lay there through the night, drifting in and out of awareness, listening to the distant sounds of fighting fade into an uneasy silence. When the rescue team finally reached me, the first face I saw clearly was not Ethan or Laura, though they were both there, worry etched deep into their expressions. It was Veltha, kneeling beside me in the dirt, her robe stained with mud she would have never allowed to touch her only days earlier. "You are alive," she said quietly, and something in her voice carried a weight I had never heard from her before. I tried to sit up, wincing at the pain in my leg. Ethan moved quickly to help steady me while Laura checked the injury, her hands moving with practiced efficiency, despite the tension in the air. "Barely," I said, my voice rough from exhaustion and thirst. Veltha did not move away, though I half expected her to step back once the immediate danger had passed, to return to the careful distance she usually kept from human soldiers. Instead, she remained kneeling beside me, watching as Laura worked, her expression unreadable, but no longer carrying the cold dismissal I remembered from that day on the ridge. "I insisted on coming myself," she said, as if answering a question I had not yet asked. "I needed to see for myself whether you had survived." "Why?" I asked, though part of me already suspected I knew the answer. She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I thought she might not answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost the sharp edges I remembered. "Because the reports from these past days have been difficult to ignore," she said. because I have watched soldiers die who might have survived if the line had held the way it always used to. Because I have begun to understand, slowly and painfully, that what I said to you was not simply cruel, it was wrong, fundamentally wrong. I studied her face, searching for any sign that this was simply another calculated move, another attempt to smooth over a problem that had grown too large to ignore. But there was something genuine in her expression, something raw that I had never seen from her before. "You still do not know my name," I said quietly. The words landed with more weight than I expected. Veltha's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment she looked almost stricken, as if the simplicity of the accusation had cut deeper than any of the larger consequences she had already begun grappling with. "I do not," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never asked. Not once, in all the time you have served alongside my command, did I think to ask your name." "Daniel," I said. "My name is Daniel Cole." She repeated it softly, as if testing the shape of the words, as if speaking my name for the first time carried a weight she had not anticipated. "Daniel," she said again, and something in her posture shifted, a small but noticeable softening that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with genuine reckoning. "You called me a tool," I continued, my voice steady, despite the exhaustion pulling at every part of me. "You said I was built for one purpose, that I did not think or plan, that I simply broke and died and called it honor. But I have thought about very little else these past 5 days, except exactly what I was willing to break myself for, and exactly what I refuse to break myself for any longer." Veltha lowered her eyes, and for the first time since I had known her, she looked genuinely humbled. "I was wrong," she said. "I have been wrong for a very long time, not only about you, but about every human soldier who has fought and bled and died under commands that never bothered to see them as anything more than expendable resources. I told myself it was simply the nature of your people, that you valued sacrifice over survival, because it was somehow built into who you are. I never once considered that perhaps you sacrificed so much because nobody ever gave you a reason to believe your survival mattered to them." Her words settled over me slowly, and I found myself unsure how to respond. Forgiveness did not come easily, not after what had been said, not after years of watching human soldiers treated as lesser within an alliance we had fought so hard to earn a place in. But there was something in the rawness of her admission that felt different from the careful political apologies I had heard before from officers trying to smooth over uncomfortable situations for the sake of appearances. "It is not enough to simply feel sorry," I said finally. "Words are easy. I have heard plenty of them over the years, from officers who meant every syllable in the moment and forgot them entirely once the crisis passed." "I understand," Veltha said. "I do not expect forgiveness simply because I have realized my mistake. I only ask for the chance to prove that this realization means something lasting, not just a reaction to difficult casualty reports." Laura finished securing the bandage around my leg and looked up, exchanging a glance with Ethan before speaking carefully. "We should get him back to camp. This conversation can continue once he has had proper medical care." Veltha nodded, and to my surprise, she helped support my weight as we made our way back toward the rescue transport, walking alongside Ethan and Laura rather than simply directing others to carry the burden. It was a small gesture, but it carried more meaning than any words could have expressed in that moment. The journey back to camp was quiet, filled mostly with the sounds of the transport moving over uneven ground and the distant echo of ongoing skirmishes elsewhere along the front. I drifted in and out of awareness, my body finally allowing the exhaustion of the past 5 days to catch up with me now that immediate danger had passed. When I woke fully, I found myself in the medical tent, my leg properly treated and elevated, my body wrapped in more bandages than I cared to count. Veltha sat nearby, waiting, though I had no idea how long she had been there. "You stayed," I said, surprised. "I wanted to be here when you woke," she said simply. "I have spent the past several hours speaking with Doran, with Ethan, with Laura, and with several other human soldiers under my command. I have learned more about the people I have commanded these past years in a single afternoon than I learned in all the time before it combined. What did you learn? I asked, curious despite myself. That courage, without recognition, eventually becomes a quiet kind of exhaustion, she said. That soldiers who feel unseen will still fight, still sacrifice, still hold the line, but something within them slowly hardens over time, a kind of protective distance that develops when respect is never offered freely. I saw that distance in your eyes the moment you removed your armor and walked away. I simply did not understand what I was looking at until now. I said nothing for a long moment, letting her words settle. Outside the medical tent, I could hear the ordinary sounds of camp continuing around us, soldiers moving between positions, equipment being repaired, the low murmur of conversation carrying through the canvas walls. Life continued, as it always did, regardless of the personal reckonings happening within individual hearts. What happens now? I finally asked. That depends on what you wish to happen, Veltha said. I cannot undo what I said. I cannot erase the years of assumptions that led me to say it. But I can choose, moving forward, to see the soldiers who serve alongside me as individuals rather than categories. I can choose to learn names before I ask for sacrifices. I can choose to ensure that recognition is no longer something humans must fight twice as hard to earn. I studied her carefully, weighing the sincerity in her words against everything that had happened over the past 5 days. There was no way to know for certain whether this change would last, whether the pressure of casualty reports and shifting alliance politics had simply forced a temporary shift in her behavior that would fade once the immediate crisis passed. But something in the way she had stayed by my side, the way she had learned my name and used it without prompting, suggested a depth of reflection that felt genuine rather than calculated. I am not ready to simply forget what happened, I said honestly, but I am willing to see whether your actions match your words moving forward. That is more than I expected when I walked away from that ridge 5 days ago. Veltha nodded, accepting the terms without argument, understanding perhaps for the first time that trust, once broken, could not simply be rebuilt through apology alone. It required consistent action, sustained over time, proven through choices made when nobody was watching closely enough to demand accountability. As the evening settled over the camp, word continued to spread about everything that had unfolded over the past 5 days. The human soldier who had removed his armor and walked away, the casualties that followed when the Alliance realized exactly what had been lost, and the slow, difficult reckoning that had brought a proud commander to sit quietly beside a wounded soldier, finally willing to see him as more than a tool built for sacrifice. The road ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time since that day on the ridge, I allowed myself to believe that something meaningful might actually change, not just for me, but for every human soldier who had spent years fighting for recognition they should have never needed to earn in the first place. 2 weeks passed before I was fully cleared to return to active duty, and in that time, the story of what had happened on that ridge had traveled far beyond our small corner of the front. It reached Alliance High Command, carried through official reports and unofficial conversations alike, until it became something more than a single incident between one commander and one soldier. It became a question that many within the Alliance had quietly avoided asking for years. How had humanity been treated, truly, beneath the surface of official partnership and shared victories? Doran was the one who told me most of what had happened during my recovery, visiting the medical tent regularly, updating me on developments that reached far beyond what I could have imagined when I first unclasped my armor and let it fall to the ground. There have been formal reviews, he explained one afternoon, sitting across from me as I worked through exercises meant to strengthen my healing leg. Alliance Command has begun examining casualty reports stretching back years, comparing human and alien losses across different fronts, different commands. The numbers tell an uncomfortable story. What kind of story? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the shape of it. Humans have consistently taken the heaviest losses across nearly every major engagement, he said. Not because your people are inherently more expendable, but because commanders like Veltha and many others besides her positioned human units in the most dangerous roles without proper acknowledgement or support. It became an unspoken assumption throughout much of the alliance, one that nobody bothered to question because humans kept showing up anyway, kept fighting anyway, kept succeeding despite being treated as less valuable than they truly were. I absorbed this information slowly, feeling a complicated mixture of vindication and sadness. Vindication, because finally, after years of quiet resentment simmering beneath the surface, the truth was being acknowledged openly. Sadness, because it had taken so much loss, so many lives, before anyone in a position of real power had bothered to look closely enough to see the pattern. "What is being done about it?" I asked. "Reforms," Doran said. "Real ones, not simply words meant to placate frustrated soldiers. Human representatives are being given greater voice in strategic planning. Recognition protocols are being rewritten to ensure that sacrifice, regardless of species, is properly honored rather than assumed and forgotten. It will take time, and there will certainly be resistance from those who benefited from the old arrangement, but the process has genuinely begun." I thought about Ethan, about Laura, about every human soldier I had served alongside who had quietly absorbed years of being treated as lesser within an alliance we had helped build and sustain. I thought about the ones who had not survived long enough to see any of this change, whose sacrifices had gone unrecognized for far too long. It was not enough. It could never fully be enough. But it was something, a beginning, where before there had only been silence. When I finally returned to active duty, the camp felt different in ways I could not entirely put into words. Human soldiers moved with a bit more confidence, a bit less of the quiet resignation that had once colored so many interactions with Alliance Command. Alien soldiers, many of them at least, had begun making genuine efforts to learn names, to ask questions, to treat partnership as something built on mutual respect rather than convenient hierarchy. Veltha found me on my first day back, standing near the same ridge where everything had begun weeks earlier. My armor still sat there, exactly where I had left it, though someone had clearly cleaned it during the time I had been recovering, the scorch marks from that first strike, carefully polished away, without erasing the story the armor still carried. "I have something for you," she said, gesturing toward the neatly arranged pieces. I looked at the armor, then at her, uncertain what she meant by the gesture. "It has been sitting here for weeks. It is still mine." "Yes," she said, "but I wanted you to know that returning it to you is not simply a formality. I have spent these past weeks reflecting on everything that happened, on everything I said, on everything I failed to understand for far too long. This armor represents more than protection. It represents the trust you place in the people you fight alongside. Trust that I broke carelessly and that you have every right to withhold from me even now." I knelt down slowly, running my fingers over the familiar plating, feeling the weight of everything that had happened settle over me in a way that felt different from the anger I had carried weeks earlier. This was not surrender. This was not forgetting. This was choice, deliberate and considered, made on my own terms rather than forced by circumstance or command. "I am not putting this back on because you asked me to," I said, looking up at her. "I know," Veltha said quietly. "I would not expect that from you, not after everything. I only hope that when you choose to wear it again, it will be because you have decided, on your own terms, that the trust between us is worth rebuilding." I stood slowly, holding the chest plate in my hands, studying the Alliance crest stamped across its surface, a symbol that had once felt hollow and now carried the possibility of meaning something different, something earned rather than simply assumed. "Doran," I said, "how do the other human soldiers feel about all of this? The reforms, the changes, everything that has happened since I walked away from this ridge?" "Cautiously hopeful," he said. "Nobody believes the work is finished." Years of unspoken assumptions do not disappear because of formal reviews and official statements. But there is a sense, I think, that something real has shifted, that the silence which once surrounded human sacrifice has finally been broken. I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The silence had been the hardest part, harder even than the physical danger we faced every day on the front lines. Fighting alongside people who saw your sacrifice as simply expected, unremarkable, unworthy of acknowledgement, wore down something deep inside a person over time, something that no amount of physical training could protect. I began putting the armor back on, piece by piece, the same way I had removed it weeks earlier, though this time the process felt entirely different. Each piece I fastened felt less like submission and more like reclamation, a decision made freely rather than an expectation fulfilled without question. Veltha watched in silence, offering no words, understanding perhaps that this moment belonged to me alone, that any interruption would diminish what the choice truly represented. When I finished, standing fully armored once more, she stepped forward and did something I never expected from her, something that would have seemed impossible on that first day when her cruel words had cut deeper than any physical strike I had ever taken. She raised her hand in a formal salute, the kind reserved for soldiers of equal standing, the kind I had never once received from her in all the years I had served under her command. "Daniel Cole," she said, my full name carrying weight and respect I had never heard from her before. "Thank you for showing me exactly what I failed to see for far too long." I returned the salute, feeling the familiar weight of the armor settle around me, protection chosen freely rather than assumed automatically, worn now with a sense of dignity that had been missing before that difficult day on the ridge. Around us, the camp continued its ordinary rhythms, soldiers moving between positions, equipment being checked and repaired, the distant sound of the front line reminding everyone that the larger conflict had not paused simply because one relationship had begun healing. But something had genuinely changed, not just between Veltha and myself, but throughout the wider alliance, a slow and difficult reckoning that had begun the moment I chose to walk away rather than accept being treated as less than I deserved. Ethan and Laura joined us not long after, along with several other human soldiers who had gathered once word spread that I had returned to full duty. They looked at my armor, freshly worn once more, and understood immediately what it represented without needing any explanation. "Good to have you back, Daniel," Laura said, a small smile breaking through the exhaustion that had marked so many recent days. "Good to be back," I said, and meant it in a way that carried deeper meaning than simple return to duty. As evening settled over the camp once more, I found myself standing near the edge of the ridge, looking out over the same battlefield where everything had begun weeks earlier. The smoke had long since cleared, replaced by the quiet stillness of a front line holding steady, human and alien soldiers working together with a renewed sense of purpose that had been sorely missing before. I thought about the walk I had taken that day, unarmored and uncertain, driven by nothing more than a refusal to accept being seen as disposable. I thought about everything that had followed, the danger, the reckoning, the slow rebuilding of trust that had once seemed impossible to imagine. It had cost more than it should have, taken longer than it needed to, and left scars that would not fully fade for a long time. But standing there, armored once more, respected finally by the very people who had once dismissed my worth entirely, I understood something I would carry with me for the rest of my life. Dignity was never something that needed to be given permission to exist. It simply needed the courage to be claimed, even when claiming it meant walking away from everything familiar and into the uncertain danger of standing alone. I had walked away that day not out of despair, but out of the quiet, unshakable belief that I deserved better than cruelty disguised as command. And in the end, that belief had changed far more than I ever expected it to, not just for myself, but for every soldier who had ever felt unseen while giving everything they had to a cause greater than themselves. The stars began to appear overhead as night fully settled over the camp, distant and unfamiliar, yet somehow steady in their presence, much like the trust that was slowly being rebuilt around me. Whatever challenges remained ahead, I faced them now not as a tool discarded and replaced at convenience, but as an equal, finally recognized for everything I had given and everything I still had left to offer. And that, more than any apology or formal reform, felt like the truest victory of all.